Yeah, I just need to make sure that we're recording slides. There we go.
Pretty much. Awesome. So welcome everyone. This is shortly after 6, so we're staying true to form, on track of being a little bit. But welcome everyone to the Brisbane Azure User Group. Okay, so this event's being recorded. These microphones are super awesome at picking up all your private conversations. It can be fun for the people online. So, you know, it's all about trade-offs, right? So speak away. We are in March. Welcome to March. A couple weeks in yet, but welcome anyway. This is your Azure news for March. Before we get into that, just a big thank you out there to our sponsors. So thank you, Spotify. Thank you, Microsoft. The wonderful beer and pizza, and really nice pizza this week, this month, and Microsoft for the venue. We're really keen to get people involved. We do have 1 or 2 slots available. If you have something you want to talk about, we'd love to hear from you. So hit us up. There's the email there. We have some openings. So love to hear from you. Love to hear anybody in the community give a talk. It doesn't have to be about an amazing new Azure thing. It can be just, how are you using Azure? What bits do you find good, bad, indifferent, anything, doesn't matter. A few updates this month. So we got Azure Advisor. So the well-architected framework is now on the Advisor portal. You can kick off an assessment, give yourself some feedback in a more structured way within the portal itself. We've got Node.js 20 for Azure Functions. So if you're a Node developer, that might be good for you. A couple of new VMs have turned up this month. You can see there that the later generation give you a lot better CPU performance, but there's a whole SKU of new VMs available. Azure SQL migration assessment enabled by Azure. Oh, it's such a big name. Like there's a big word mouthful there. So what is this? So if you're like about a year ago, I think we had the Arc enabled servers. I don't know actually. I think it's about a year. So you can install these agents on your machines, and they're going to help you manage your fleet of on-premise servers. On top of that, we now have the ability for it to generate assessments on your SQL Server databases to look at, what are the recommended SQL products you could migrate to, what's the compatibility with Azure SQL. So that can give you that continuous feedback as you're moving and optimizing and readying your on-premise SQL to a transition into the cloud. So the Arc enabled servers do a whole bunch more stuff, which is really cool, like all sorts of stuff, and gives you that visibility into your on-premise fleet of servers. And I just want to sort of pitch that one a little bit more, because for those of you who don't have your servers enabled by Azure Arc, maybe it's worth thinking about, especially if you're a big Azure user, getting that single pane of glass across your fleet and being able to manage your portfolio and understanding where things are, what needs to be patched, etc. It's pretty good. Worth checking out. Azure Backup. Well, we got a few things in Azure Backup. VMs using premium SSD v2, and we got VMs using Ultra disks. So there's new availabilities there. We got backup for AKS, so regional disaster recovery. That's where you're sort of like getting that into another cluster so that you can restore from the alternate region, or offsite, if you want to think it that way. So you think. Storage actions, these aren't really available here for Australian users in France and Canada. But if you're in France or Canada, these could be really cool. So little tiny actions that you can do on your storage, like your large volumes of storage. It can run across all of your files and do some fairly simple actions, but pretty cool, worth checking out. Azure Firewall, a couple of things. Parallel IP group update. So that's where you can roll out those updates to larger groups. The trace logs, flow trace logs, that's at the TCP handshake level. It gives you a bit of better visibility into what's going on there. And another auto scaling, sorry, mental blank option. So in addition to the throughput and the CPU based auto scaling, you can now auto scale based on the number of connections. So it's just expanding that capability a little bit. Azure Application Gateway, TLS and TCP protocols, pretty big mouthful. So well, that sort of like extends your application gateway into those non HTTP based protocols, which is pretty cool. Now, Azure Application Gateway for containers. This will give you like faster performance, near real time reflect your actual pods that you've got in Kubernetes and passing up through that gateway connection. It's got routes, probes, and other load balancing configurations within Kubernetes that you can take advantage of in a platform service. So, bit of an AKS session here. Apologies for all those AKS haters. You know, you have to stick with it. It gets better. Istio-based service mesh. So, service mesh is something like if you're getting into that microservice architecture and you want something a little bit simpler to help manage it. There's a bunch of different options out there in that microservice space. Azure AKS has got service mesh, and it's baked in. It's just taking that open source code, putting it into AKS, testing it, making sure it's really good, and helping you with that observability and traffic management and security for your AKS cluster. All right. So a few extra resources here. So Slack, YouTube, some training. We've got some blogs that are pretty cool. And tonight, without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Bernie White. So he's a cloud solution architect at Microsoft, founder of several open source products, personally badgered me until I picked up Bicep, and now I'm the biggest Bicep fan in the world. So he's done the community a service there. Tonight, we're going to learn about everything you need to know about Bicep in 2024. Welcome. Yeah.
Cool. I've got a few slides to get started, but we will be doing mostly demos. Yeah, I'm Cloud Solution Architect. If you want to follow me on LinkedIn, then by all means, go ahead. And there's also a link to one of my projects. So we're going to cover off Bicep language and the context in very brief for the people that are new to Bicep or haven't really worked too much with it. And then we're going to jump straight into how you actually get using it, and really the new features that have come out recently as well, that are really going to help you, one, make life easier for you, but also then allow you to apply that to your organization, whatever size it is. And then we'll look at briefly around broader ecosystem and resources and community. So, you know, in a nutshell, Bicep is just a text-based representation of your Azure resources, right? It's called infrastructure as code. Again, you've probably heard about that a little bit. And then because it's a text-based representation, then this allows us to take advantage of a few different features that sort of come with the fact that it's infrastructure as code. It allows us to put it into source control. And then, you get things like you can copy and paste your servers as opposed to having to click through a wizard. You also get, when you put it in things like source control, you get approval gates. So when you deploy a resource to Azure, if you're clicking through the Azure portal, you don't get an approval mechanism. You hit deploy, and then it goes and does its thing. Obviously, if you're putting it through text into source control, you can also add in additional gates and controls, right? So maybe you have a change process and you want to then map your deployment process to your change process. You could absolutely do that within an infrastructure as code setting. Greater consistency, it allows you to put obviously the code in, or the infrastructure, configure it, and then at a later date go ahead and deploy it, which obviously allows you to review it and sort of make sure, one, it's consistent, but it also allows you to draw on patterns that then you might have across your organization as well, right? Again, greater consistency. And also then this also helps unlock scenarios around lower privilege environments as well, because when people are deploying to Azure, if they're clicking directly in the portal, they need permissions to do that. They need to be able to write to Azure, deploy whatever resources they have. In the scenario of around DevOps and infrastructure as code, it's very easy then to pare back permissions so that people generally don't have access to make changes in your environment, apart from maybe an elevation or emergency access type request scenario. But then they can then have permissions to go ahead and just to commit the code and then go through a peer review process, right? Before it actually gets rolled out to the environment. So, why Bicep? So Bicep is a native tool. It's built by the teams that manage Azure, a component of Azure called Azure Resource Manager, which is the main, pretty well the external facing orchestrator of deploying resources in Azure. So you interact with ARM in many different ways. You interact with it when you go ahead and click through the Azure portal. And you also interact with it going through different command line options that you might use, or REST APIs. And you interact also through it using Bicep or ARM templates. You also interact with various aspects of it, even when you go ahead and use things like Terraform, which is a third-party infrastructure as code language as well. So using ARM everywhere, and really Bicep is built by the same team to take advantage of a lot of those additional features, right? Also, when it gets to managing things such as secrets and also distribution of patterns in Bicep code, again, there's an Azure native way to do that as opposed to necessarily going outside that ecosystem. Simpler syntax. So you can think of Bicep as an evolution of one of Microsoft's earlier attempts, which was ARM templates, which is a JSON-based structure, which we won't really touch on too much, but basically this is a language that then has designed with simplicity in mind. One of the big drivers for developing the Bicep language was to reduce errors that customers were experiencing. So it's pretty well been designed from the ground up with that in mind to reduce errors from infrastructure as code standpoint. And they do have absolutely statistics behind this that say that it significantly improves the success of deployments if you start using Bicep as opposed to something like ARM templates. Also, it's again, with that in mind as well, they've also developed an extension for VS Code and Visual Studio that then, again, really helps to accelerate the development process and reduce errors. And we'll talk a lot about that, and we'll go through some demos as well. Define and reuse patterns. So again, like I sort of alluded to before, one of the key things that we want to do is we want to get greater reuse. So if we know what a server should look like, you probably need to deploy maybe more than one server at a point in time. So why not just make a pattern for a server and then roll that out as many times as we need to? Again, similar occurs for lots of different applications. Often in an organization, you design applications commonly in a similar way. So if you have to deploy one application with maybe a web app and a backend, you're probably going to use similar architecture through other applications that you deploy. So again, you can roll out a pattern for that as well. Cool. And also, there's also community developed patterns as well. So there's also other patterns that then are built by Microsoft, but also the community, such as Azure landing zones and Azure verified modules, which we'll also talk about as well. So you can take advantage of those too. So let's jump into Visual Studio Code and get started. Cool. So yes, so in Visual Studio Code, let me slightly zoom in. Hopefully that is readable for everybody. If it is not, let me know. So to get started with Bicep, you don't necessarily need any extensions, but definitely to obviously take advantage of the all the IntelliSense and pretty well the things that I was talking about then, you do want to install the Bicep extension, which you can just get from within Visual Studio Code and basically hit install. That will, along with that, that will come down with the pretty well all the tools you need to effectively run Bicep. So once you've got that installed, then really it's just a matter of creating a Bicep file. So a Bicep file is any file that then ends in a Bicep extension. So let's just call it example Bicep, and we have a file. And so from here, we can go ahead and pretty well start using some of the capabilities. So one of the examples is if we want to deploy a resource. So I'll take a storage account because it's pretty simple as opposed to having too many complex things. We can go ahead and just type resource. You'll also notice that there's also a bunch of other little basically snippets effectively that will also appear in the IntelliSense, which also allows us to go ahead and choose a storage account, and it will then obviously populate out for us. If we were going to go ahead and do that manually, so if we want to do resource, we could go ahead and call it storage, and then we can then type part of the name, and it will start to then filter down what we have available to us, and we can sort of say, yep, that's what we wanted. Want the storage account. It'll then ask us what API version we want to use. And so how this relates is in Azure, resources change over time, right? We add new features all the time. And so basically to make sure that then resources and your infrastructure's code maintains compatibility over time, we've released a new API version which includes those features, right? And so the general principle is maybe in a future time, we may change a parameter or remove a parameter or make it different, work differently. And so we'll add those features to a newer API version. And then if you're still using the old API version, then generally for most intents and purposes, it'll continue to work exactly how you, when you wrote that code, right? Until such time as maybe we deprecate it. Historically, we haven't really done that. More recently, we've started removing some preview versions. So you can sort of see here, this one has a preview next to it, which is sort of like a beta release flag or something similar to that. So it works differently for different resource providers. But for most intents and purposes, the general principle is whenever we write our code, we can go ahead and use the latest version, develop our code as is, make sure it all works, test it in our environment, and then, you know, if it's a year later we don't necessarily need to go ahead and just upgrade our code. We probably want to because we want to take advantage of new features, but we don't necessarily have to because Microsoft changed something under the hoods, right? So that's the idea. So we get the version, we add an equals, and again, you can sort of see we've got another IntelliSense popping up to sort of say, here are the options that we can do. So these options here, for and for filtered, for indexed, these are all about adding loops. So if I don't want to add one storage account, I want to add more than one, then I can very easily do that. And we'll have a look at that in a sec. For the moment, I'm just going to go ahead and do required properties, which is basically sort of saying, create me a storage account and fill in or tell me what I need to populate at a minimum, effectively, right? And so, as you can imagine, we need to populate a name for the storage account. So we'll just add that in there. So we can just add a string. We'll just call it storage 001. That won't deploy, of course, because that's probably not unique. But we will get back to that. We also want to have a location. So we could just go ahead and pop in like a location here, like Australia East. But I've got to spell it correctly, right? We could also go ahead and add a space in there too. Azure will generally accept both. Then we need to give it a name. So let me just go ahead and do screencast mode. And so if you use control space, it will then populate what are the options. So this basically comes from schema. So all these APIs, these microservices that sit behind Azure, they publish an open APIs basically spec, which basically is a schema to sort of say how the API can be used. And effectively Bicep goes ahead and grabs that and then basically gives us our available options, right? So the cool thing about this is that as we release new API versions, it becomes available and clear to use within the IDE very quickly. So anyway, we can choose the SKU that we want to use. So maybe we want to use standard locally redundant storage as an example. We can also, again, control space here. And again, we've got available kinds that we can use of different storage. So this is the storage V2 is the common one that gets used. If we go ahead and control space down here, we'll also see that we also have other properties that we can set. So if we go ahead and set properties, then we can sort of see we've got a whole bunch of other additional options that we can use. So maybe we want to go ahead and set minimum TLS version to 1.2. We can absolutely go ahead and do that, right? So yeah, so that's, I guess, a starting point. You'll also see there are different squiggles here. So these I guess these orange yellow squiggles, these are more like warnings. You'll also see potentially errors as well from time to time. So when we didn't have our mandatory properties populated, and you could sort of see there's a squiggle here. Again, you can hover over that and sort of say, hey, we expect something here. Right. So the IntelliSense is generally quite good. And so that makes it much easier to, one, write the code and get it right, hopefully close to the first time. But also then it makes it quite fast when you sort of get proficient in it, right? So yeah, there's also some tools that we can use within VS Code and just in general, like our patterns that I was mentioning before, that will also accelerate the process too. So I've got a storage account. That's great. I could go ahead and deploy that to Azure. Of course, in this case here, I've hard-coded everything. So we're probably one of the first things we want to do, again, to make a pattern, make it reusable. Again, if I've got a production environment and a development environment, I probably want two different storage accounts. I want one for dev, I want one for prod. So I might need to start then parameterizing this so that I can deploy those out to different environments. Or if somebody else or a different application team wants to use the code that I've written, people can just plug parameters in as opposed to rewrite the code, right?
Sorry, Bernie, there's something about scope for resource group subscription that needs to be considered.
Yeah, I'll cover that.
Okay, good, thanks.
Good question though. So yeah, so generally when you open up a bicep file, I guess to like a question around scope is that things that you put in the file are assumed to be at the resource group scope, right? Which is the normal place where we'd put everything in Azure, right? Because it's a mandatory container for most resources. We can go ahead and change the scope, which I'll cover in a little while, but basically this is at a resource group scope. So let's go ahead and write some parameters. So again, I can use my IntelliSense here. You can sort of see I just type P and I've got param, right? I can give it a name now. So maybe I want the name of my storage account and the location, right? These are probably pretty common things. So I can type name and again, ST, and I've got string. So I've got a parameter with a string type because it's going to be text. So I can then go ahead and plug this in here. And then for my location, again, I can go ahead and param location and again, string as well, right? You can see that my squiggly's gone away now. One of the things though that I might want to do is again, often when we're going and deploying Azure resources, we often want to deploy them to the same location where our resource group is. So I can also do something like resource group and actually get the current location of my resource group when I deploy this. So at a future time, when I deploy this, whatever my location of my resource group is, automatically handle that as my parameter, right? So again, one thing that I don't really need to set, it just happens for me. Of course, because this is now a parameter though, I could potentially override it if I wanted to, but if I don't do anything, then it's just going to assume that location. Cool, so I've got my my bicep code there. I've got I parameterized it initially, which is great. Let's have a look at a few additional options. Now maybe I want to go ahead and call that via another file. For this, I actually have a few different options. So if I was so I've got reusable code now, but then I actually need to at some point provide the name of my storage account and the my resource group location or whatever location. So I can do that in two different ways. One is I actually can go ahead and just create, so let's call it prod, let's just call it prod bicep, right? I can just create another bicep file. And so we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a sec, but I'll create my prod bicep file, and now I can actually just go ahead and start referencing my other files. So I'm using what's called now a module. So a module is nothing really special about a module. Module is just a term used for reusable code, but effectively it's just a bicep file. So so in this case here, example becomes my module, right? Because that's my reusable code, right? Now I can just go to say this is this is my my storage, right? And you'll sort of see again, hit space, it automatically picked up there was another file in the same directory, so I can just select that. Space equals space, required properties, and again, it's going to give me a whole bunch of things that I need to fill out. You'll notice here that then name is effectively, if I control click, this name here, my name property. So let me just go ahead and make things slightly easier because there is actually two names, as you might have noticed. I can then go ahead and add, this is completely optional, but again, when we're making reusable code, this makes it a whole lot easier to go ahead and use and consume. So let's just call this is the name of the storage account. Cool. And this will be the deployment location. This defaults to the resource group location. Okay. Cool. Go back here. I can hover over there and you can sort of see the name of the storage account, right? It's automatically picking that up. So why do we have two names here? So this is a reasonably common question. And so basically the first name at the top here is actually the name of the deployment. When we go ahead and create, basically when we're referencing this example file, it'll actually create an extra deployment for us, and it will basically name whatever we put in this field here. So we just call this deploy 001. It'll name the deployment itself that name, right? Which can be confusing. We could have chosen a different name for our parameter here, such as, storage account name or something like that instead. So if we can go ahead and right click on here, rename symbol, and choose storage account name, you can sort of see again anywhere where that name appeared in that file is automatically updated. Unfortunately, it won't update this file over here, so it will still be name, but we can go ahead and now type storage account name and then call our storage account whatever we like. So let's call it ST or storage 01. We'll use that 001 again. Cool. So this name here at the moment is mandatory. However, there is actually a preview feature, which I'll show you in a sec, which actually allows you to go ahead and have Azure just automatically name that. So you don't then need to worry about what the deployment name is anymore. It'll just go ahead and use a hashing algorithm effectively to go ahead and generate a theoretically unique name, right? So that's a preview feature which is coming, or experimental feature which is coming, which you can use now, but it is just behind a feature flag. And so we've still got a warning here. So it's basically parameter location of modular storage isn't assigned an explicit value. So this is more of a best practice rule. Again, you can sort of see, I can see it very clearly from a warning perspective. So effectively, this is sort of saying, it wants me to go ahead and set a location and then set that to a parameter of this file, which we've sort of already done. So it's sort of unnecessary anyway. So there's a few different things that we can do. We can go ahead and disable that warning entirely, which we can do in our linter. So we'll come back to that. But for the moment, let's just go ahead and set this to the location up here, and we'll effectively do what we did before. String equals source group location. Cool. So now we have effectively a deployment. We're deploying our storage account, and we can now go ahead and do a production deployment. If we wanted to do a development deployment, so maybe this is prod, right? Then we could absolutely go ahead and just create two of these files, and that would deploy example independently. There's also a special type of file as well. So this, when we use a deployment like this, it actually allows us to pull in multiple resources at the same time. So even though example is reusable, we could also have other resources that are usable as well. So if we go ahead and module, type in, I have a set of some modules here that I've already built. So we can go ahead and add in a key vault as well. And then we can effectively go ahead and find that on the path by going back a few directories, find it. And again, you can sort of see it populates out, and then required properties, away we go. So very easily, I can then pull together multiple reusable deployments until I get my app now, right? Another approach we can take is that we can go ahead and use a parameter file. It's more of a dedicated parameter file. So for all intents and purposes, this prod.bicep is a parameter file. We send it to Azure, away it goes. It'll then build out the deployment. We don't really need to do anything more. But there is also a dedicated parameter file type as well, so if we go ahead and do prod, it's called bicep param. So see that there. And again, it's got a slightly different option. The main difference with this type of file is that it will only allow us to reference one module. So in case here, we can reference two. In this case here, this is a parameter file directly for our specific module. So to do that, we've got a slightly different syntax we can use using. And then again, we can go ahead and find our file. And if we hover over here, it'll basically tell you, storage account name is a mandatory parameter, right? And we can then quickly go ahead and then fill that out just like we did before, with whatever our storage, dev, or prod in this case, property was, right? 001.
Is there in case in there you can do something like storage account or store plus get time, blah blah blah, something like that? Has it got enough sophistication to do something like that on the fly?
Yeah. So the Bicep format does allow for some basic functions. If we go ahead and
Deploy, the name deploy, whatever.
yeah, so if we just remove that and then control space, you can sort of see there's actually a whole bunch of different functions that can be used for different things, and we'll use some of those anyway. But when we are in the Bicep parameter file, there is language restrictions in terms of what we can use. So if we go ahead and sort of see, there is quite a lot of functions there. I think not all of these are is actually allowable. I think that's probably slightly wrong, but let's just try. Let's try format. Actually, I think that's fine. So yeah, you can use some functions within in the parameter file. Not all functions are available. In terms of, I guess, the question around, can we use date, basically current date time, which I think is UTC. It's not one of those options. UTC is a special function that can only be used on. So the example would be, we want to have something named or set based on the current date and time, right? So there's a reason why it's generally not used that much. And so obviously the idea would be, if we deploy in a storage account and then the name changes every time based on time, then effectively it means every time we run the template, it will generate a new storage account, because it's not idempotent, it's a different name every time. So it's generally, so some functions are restricted in that we can only go ahead and use them on the parameter block, and you'll sort of see there's a UTC now time there. But again, you sort of need to be super careful about using those things, because again, it could generate like additional resources or changes in your infrastructure that you may or not want. But there are absolutely cases where you do want to use it. And so that's what the function is for when you do want to use it, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking of the deployment name. That's
Yeah, so the deployment name, so you can absolutely go ahead and use for the deployment name something like UTC date time. There are name restrictions around it though, so the easiest way is actually to go ahead and use the new experimental feature. So within basically Bicep has a configuration file. You can actually create multiple files of this. So it's called bicepconfig.json. By default, it's going to, you can create one at the root of your repository, but you can also go ahead and create one further down, closer to the content. And basically Bicep will pick up whatever file is closest to the content wherever you're writing it, right? Generally, you'd sort of create one at the root and maybe override it further down if you needed to. But within here, there is then the ability to go ahead and turn on basically the analyzers. And so these analyzers is basically the linting conditions or these squigglies, right? So these squigglies here. So all these this can actually for most cases be configured, right? So there is different things here. So one of the ones was about location. So explicit values for lock parameters. And again, then you can go ahead and turn on, what do we want to do with it? So level warning. So by default, it's a warning, but then we can also go ahead and turn it off to off, right? In which case then we won't be warned about those things. You can also go ahead and do them in line as well. So, so for these things here, I think it's this will just be above the parameter, and then so it's hash disable next line, and then it'll automatically pick up on the next line, what are the things that are currently failing, and then just provide intelligence based on that, and away the warning disappears. So you can go ahead and do that multiple ways, whatever makes sense. Often if there's things that your sort of organization sort of says, or it's not applicable for that repository, we just don't care about, then you can just turn it off in the main. Otherwise, you can go ahead and do it on a per line basis, right? So that's quite effective to make your life easier. So yeah, so you can go ahead and set this via the parameter file, and obviously now we've got a prod parameter file. We can go ahead and create a dev bicep param, right? And then obviously do the same thing. In fact, we can absolutely go ahead and take advantage of copy and paste, and then, you know, change this to 2 or whatever it is that we're doing, right? Doesn't really matter. So yeah, a few things there to take advantage of. Let's just double check what we've got so far. So basic syntax. Yeah, so let's come back to some of those other advanced options that we're talking about here when we're going and building out a resource. So go ahead and do resource. Let's choose our storage again. Cool. And so one of the things, actually, we'll just populate that again. So maybe we want to go ahead and create more than one storage account. So we can go ahead and use 4. And so this is going to be for each item in list. So basically it's going to go ahead and go through an array and then loop around depending on how many items we have. So if we want to go ahead and set this up, maybe we can call this storage account names. And now it's a string array. So it contains more than one, right? Or potentially one, but it could be many, right? And so then we can go ahead and sort of say for storage account names, we can call this whatever. At the moment, it's called default item, but we can just call this name, right? And then now we can go ahead and set the name of the storage account to be the current name property from here. Or we can call this maybe something slightly easier, maybe item name, right? Item name. And again, now really to create more than one storage account, it would just be a matter of going and up here, storage account names, square bracket. And now we can have storage prod 002, right? So obviously we can then start deploying multiple fairly quickly, right? There's also additional things that we can do here in terms of constraints. So again, it might be helpful to understand, okay, well, maybe we need at least one storage account name, right? So we can also then go ahead and do min length as being 1. And so when we go ahead and then fully empty that, it's going to sort of say, hey, you know, there's a problem here, right? So we can also add some basic constraints around that. Again, this just helps with the authoring experience to get things right. So let's, I'm just going to slightly turn off screencast mode now because it is getting a little bit in the way. But let's go back now and try a few additional things. So I guess hands up, who's deployed a storage account in Azure before? Yeah, probably half the room. So for the rest of the people, have you just deployed different things? Hands up. Yeah, cool, awesome. So yeah, so a storage account really is just a place to store files, and it's used in lots of different applications. You could use anything really, but in this case here, storage account's pretty straightforward, so that's why I'm using it. But one of the things that we need to deploy in Azure is if we go to Actually, we'll go to it in a sec. So one of the things that we can do before we can actually use the storage account is we actually need to put a container. And so a container is sort of like a folder. So we need to have at least one folder to actually put stuff in, right? And so we can have many containers, but we sort of need to do at least one to get started. So we can go ahead now and define our container. So if we go ahead and do resource, we just control this containers or container. And again, this would be a prime case where we want to potentially go ahead and define more than one.
Should that still be an array if I misunderstood?
Yeah, good point. We can go ahead and we can actually go ahead and set this to be minimum length of 3, which is actually the minimum length for a storage account name. And we can go ahead and make this a max length of 23 as well. For again, just for validation. And then we can go ahead and define a parameter to then set our containers. And this is going to be an array. And we'll expand this out in a sec. And we'll make this by default, there'll be 0 elements or no containers created, but we obviously will want to set one. And let's go ahead and just populate this out now. So storage account. And jump into containers. And this will be a prime case where we can go ahead and do for each container item in containers. And then we're going to need a name of the container, which is just going to be item. Actually, it will be the item.name, which I haven't defined yet. But we'll see that in a sec. We can go ahead and then define the properties. And so the container will have things such as, is it anonymous access or not? So public access, it might have then potentially additional metadata, right? And so if we want to then also set these properties here, we can go ahead and do item dot public access, and we'll just leave it at that for the moment. And so for the people that have probably done this in the past, this will probably be a fairly familiar process. We wanted to potentially define 0 or many containers, and we can go ahead and define it like this. And then when we go ahead and come back to our, just set this back up again, storage 001. And then when we go ahead and define our containers, we can now go ahead and define our containers. However, the issue is that it doesn't really help us as to what do we actually need to set. We need to set a name and we need to set a public access, right? Which was basically from here, public access. So again, this is sort of where the experience might be a little bit breaky from previous, but the good news now is that some of the newer features that have been added now allows us to add custom types. And so the cool thing about this is we can actually define what does this container actually look like? What does one instance of this thing look like? And so to do that, we can now go ahead. And so we know what it looks like from down here. We know that it has a name property and it has a public access property. So now we can go ahead and define a type called a container. And we can call it a container type so it doesn't clash with anything else. And then we can sort of say this thing has a name, which is a string, and it also has a public access, which could also be a string, but more specifically, if we go ahead and hover over this down here, we can see that it only can actually be blob container or none, right? So we can actually just go ahead and cheat and just throw this up here. And then we can go ahead and sort of say this property now should go ahead and use container type, and it's an array of container types, right? And so now when we go back over here and we control space, now we can see we've got a name, right? Which obviously makes this way easier to use than before. And if we go public access, again, space, we also get IntelliSense there because these are the only available properties. If we want to take that even a step further, we can then go ahead and sort of say at description and sort of say the name of the container. And we can say the type of anonymous access. And then, because we didn't spell it all, we can just go ahead and do that, which is not a Bicep feature, by the way, but is a spell check feature, which is also helpful. And so now when we go ahead and hover over here, we can see that we have a description of what is actually required, right? Cool. And we can also, again, do that there. And so, and you can sort of see again, it's already not allowing me to do that because it actually needs to be one of these, right? The other thing that we can do is maybe we don't want to set public access, right? The reality of the situation is 99.9% of the time, we don't want anonymous access to our data, right? Probably almost 100% of the time. For the like 1.000%, you know, maybe, right? Who knows? But the reality is that we don't want that. We just want that to be like none by default, right? And so we shouldn't necessarily need to specify it. So what we can do instead is we can actually go ahead and then make this basically nullable. So basically, it'll basically then make this now an optional property effectively. So type of anonymous access by default, no access. Cool. And so now if I go ahead and create another container here, it'll sort of say, it's got some red squigglies saying, hey, we actually need a required name property, right? But it's okay without specifying anything else, right? And so to complete this, that would potentially set it as null, which I think may or may not be good for this resource. So what we actually do want to do now is we want to then sort of say when basically the public access property is not set, then automatically make this none, right? And so then we only need to specify it if we want to change it. And if we don't want to change it, it just inherits the secure default that we want, right? Again, making this easier because, you know, nobody really wants to write or configure things that should just be like enterprise standard, right? And for the, you know, small percentage of the time where you do need to change it, you still have the ability to do it, but you don't need to think about it if you just want to accept the defaults, right? Cool, we could do this the same for the metadata, but we won't bother. Again, we could also go ahead and set, okay, well, the minimum length for this also maybe is 3, and maybe we sort of set, okay, well, we want a maximum length of up to 12 for our container name. If we go ahead and then jump back here, then you'll also see now that this is now starting to fail because it doesn't meet the constraints. So we need to have at least 3 letters in there, and it's all happy. That's just saying that it's an unknown word. Cool. So custom types, definitely use them. If you're using Bicep at all, you definitely want to get into custom types. It was experimental. It's not now. So definitely use it. It will save you a bunch of time. And even for scenarios whereby you used to do things like, even if you haven't done everything with custom types yet, maybe you're in the process of getting to it. You could go ahead and do array for many cases. Containers probably a bad example, but say for example we had maybe a parameter array which was, let's just call it names or something like that. Maybe it was the name of our storage account or container name. We could, traditionally, we would have used array like that, right? The issue with this though is that when we go ahead and space here, it's an array type. It doesn't really need to know what to do with it, right? It says it's an array, but it doesn't really help you out any further than that, right? So what you can also go ahead and do is, okay, well, maybe this is an array of strings. We can actually just change it to string array like that instead. And now it actually knows it's a string. Or we could go ahead and change it to an object array. And so then again, VS Code and IntelliSense is going to know. So as soon as we start to then populate it out, it's actually going to automatically at least fill in those curly brackets for you, right? With almost no changes to the functionality at all. But again, some additional validation there. Cool. Any questions? Awesome.
All right, I've got another one.
Yep, go ahead.
Ask a question. I feel bad.
No, you go ahead.
So you showed us the linter before with regards to picking up location and had some smarts about that, which I presume, well, wasn't too sure, but I presume things like it knew for some schema or some lookup what the locations around the world were. For storage accounts, you explicitly went out of your way and made the minimum max length, and there's the horror with it. It's only lowercase, alphanumeric, no space, blah blah blah.
Mhm.
Is there a linter with that sort of smarts to know that? No,
Not today.
that's right.
Not today.
That's right. No, I was just curious.
So the reason for that is it's not in the schema. So it's not in the schema of the actual resource. So I guess the team that are building that haven't actually put that as a validation requirement within the schema. So yeah, Bicep doesn't really know about it. But yeah, I mean, maybe over time. But yeah, as it more develops, then different teams are trying to improve their process as well, right? But yeah, there's other ways you could do it from a testing perspective. But yeah, in terms of Bicep won't necessarily automatically pick that up. Cool. So that's some, I guess, some basic features there. So again, we can then harness a few different things here. So we have snippets, as you could sort of see. So these snippets that come up by default are fairly basic. There's for a lot of resources, they've been defined, which they're really just a good starting point. But you can actually go ahead and help yourself out as well, just by, again, taking advantage of the native tooling in VS Code as well, and do things such as, let's say I wanted to create a new, or maybe this is a key vault Bicep module, right? So in VS Code, it's actually super easy to go ahead and create your own snippets. And I'll show you how to do that in a sec. So if I just type in Bicep, right, you'll see these things come up. These are actually ones that I've defined. So I can actually just go ahead and do, okay, well, I want to do a Bicep module, right? And then I want it to be a key vault module, right? And then again, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's already populated for me. Probably pretty good chance that you're going to be setting a name and location and tags, and probably a few other things as well for almost everything that you write. So again, you can actually just have that automatically populated, and then that's a good starting point. Super easy. All you need to do is just go to your .vs code folder, and you go ahead and create a file such as bicep.code-snippets. And this is a JSON file where you basically go ahead and sort of say, this is the one that we just used then was this one here. So you basically sort of say, so this name here is completely arbitrary. You can call it whatever you like. The prefix is basically what you're going to type to start to trigger the snippet. The scope basically says only apply this for the Bicep language. So if you're typing in Markdown or JSON, you don't get the snippet pop up, and you don't get snippets for other languages pop up. And then you basically just within the square brackets here, you basically go ahead and just put the lines you want to insert, and job done. You can then enhance that even further by setting description. And then this appears when you go ahead and Bicep, it'll hover here and it will sort of show you what that is, right? So that, you know, that's nice, not really required, but it's nice to have. You can also go ahead and add these placeholder values here, and you'll notice when I went ahead and did Bicep module, then it automatically selected multiple locations in the file. And then as I typed key vault, it automatically replaced it. I can actually also go tab, and also it'll also populate down here as well. And so that's basically just by this $1 : so this to the right hand side of this is basically just what gets populated as sort of like the initial text. And then as you type, it just replaces it. And when you press tab, it'll go to wherever the next number is, right? And anything that has the same number, it'll obviously just type simultaneously across all of those. So again, super easy to go ahead and create some starter points to then really build out modules or build out deployments really quick. An example would be for, if I go ahead and have a look at my deployment down here, maybe I want to go ahead and I've got a resource group here. So maybe I want to go ahead and create a new resource group. So RG demo 001, and we'll just call this deploy.bicep, right? Now over here, we can go ahead and again, Bicep RG deployment. And now this automatically has my actually resource group module automatically referenced in it. So I can now just go ahead and do something like demo 001. In this case here, I've actually named the directory slightly different, but let's call this dev, right? And then we'll make this something else. But now we'll go ahead and set this as a demo. Bernie's the contact. There's also the contact here, and the amount in budget. And so this is, again, reusable module. Pretty good chance you want to go ahead and deploy resource groups in Azure, since we sort of force you to do it for everything anyway. So again, here you'll sort of notice a few things, that we have things like, okay, we have a budget start date and a budget amount. So in terms of deploying a module, if we have a look at this in here, I have my module, which deploys my resource group with my tags. Pretty straightforward. But then we go ahead and potentially go ahead and add resource group blocks. We go ahead and add action groups for notifications for resource health of anything that's deployed in there. We then go ahead and deploy one for our billing contact as well. And then we go ahead and deploy budget for our resource group too, right? Because everybody wants to do cost control and understand how much they're actually consuming in Azure, right? So again, for what looks to be a matter of 20 lines thereabouts, under the covers we're doing so much, and it's not too much effort in terms of filling out a resource group. And now we can go ahead and add all our other resources down here, and chain them together, right? Go ahead.
Are those snippets shared amongst the team?
So yes, they are. So great question. So are the snippets shared? So yes, in this case here, they are. The reason is because they're part of the workspace, because they're just checked into the repo like everything else. Then everybody else that opens up VS Code in this directory will automatically get them. So the whole team can use them. It is possible to go ahead and create user snippets as well. And when you create user snippets, then they're just your personal snippets, but they will also, if you have it set up by signing in and syncing on, then it'll actually share across different devices as well, which is also quite helpful. But yeah, definitely for teams, then putting your snippets is a great idea. Also tasks, which we might touch on if we have time. So yeah, so that's I guess that's some of the key components. Let's just double check and make sure that we cover. So we covered, I think, a few of these modules. So yeah, so modules like we started saying, just reusable code in a separate file. The cool thing though, and I've talked about this in another presentation previously, so definitely feel free to go ahead and check out the Brisbane Azure User Group YouTube channel, and you can find it there where I talk about it in detail. But effectively, our modules, we can also go ahead and publish from a location into a central location that then actually can be shared across our whole organization. And so I will actually share this repo and publish it later. So you're more than welcome to look at the code. But I actually have within my VS Code, I have some tasks. So I can actually go ahead and Control-Shift-R. And so this is actually not a default shortcut. It doesn't come up by default. You need to keybind it, which you can do by doing the settings and configuring key bindings. But you can go ahead and define reusable tasks within the repo, right? And so I've got one for publishing modules and deploying a stack, which we'll talk about in a sec. But basically these tasks are again also just in our repo. And they're basically just a command line that we can use. But the cool thing about them is that in VS Code, again, they're really helpful for scenarios like this. Again, probably in an enterprise environment, if we're going to publish to prod, then we're probably going to go through source control and peer review and all those good things, right? But for a development environment, we could very easily go ahead and sort of say, okay, well, I've got my Key Vault module here. I want to go ahead and push that to my environment, publish module. What's the name of the module? It's called Key Vault, right? And it's version 1. And then that kicks off a task, basically, that has a command line pre-populated, which is just going to go ahead and push our module into our Bicep registry, which actually then goes ahead and lives in Azure over here. And let's bring that over here. And so this is a common location that then we can use across our organization. So hopefully within a few moments, we should have a Key Vault one there. But basically, the idea now is that across the organization, this is just one repository. So we've got a module in one repository, but now we want to share that across the organization because you probably just don't have one repository in your organization. You probably have many, right? So there's going to be lots of teams that then want to go ahead and consume the code, right? So again, we can absolutely go ahead and do that.
But you published the module, you weren't, you're too quick for me on slide. That wasn't deploying your keyboard, you were publishing the module of that.
I was publishing the module, that's right. Yeah.
So that's what the command line was, module publish, not keyboard deploy.
That's right. So the command line was Azure Bicep publish. We gave it the file, and then we basically sort of said, go ahead and publish it to this location in the registry, and we also sort of said, go and link this documentation to it as well, because then when we go ahead and consume it, so if we now want to go over to our deploy Bicep down here, we can now go ahead and reference it. And so how these modules are referenced is you can actually go ahead and use the fully qualified name that we used here, right? Probably don't want to type that in. Instead, what we can actually do is within our Bicep config is we can go ahead and set an alias, which I've already done, which basically then sort of says, hey, demo is the alias that we'll use, and then automatically then go ahead and find it from here at this path. And so then that gives us the ability to then go ahead and sort of say, okay, well, now we want to go ahead and deploy our Key Vault. So we'll use module. This is our Key Vault. And then we can use BR demo. And then we called it Key Vault. And then V1. Unfortunately, it doesn't in IntelliSense like that at the moment, but that is absolutely coming. And once it restores it, so you'll notice that the red line just changed and disappeared, which is basically it went and talked to the Bicep registry, pulled down the module locally, and now we have again also full IntelliSense on that, right? Which is pretty cool. Again, similar, if we hover over, we have all the normal stuff. There's an experimental feature as well, which then also allows us to go ahead and, although it is experimental and it wasn't working for me earlier today, go to definitions. So it may not work for me now, but it will actually then allow you to go ahead and explore the code as well. Not from the original source repo, but from basically the file that it uploaded effectively. So this is again pretty cool. If we hover over here, again, we can also have description information. So this comes from this metadata at the top, right? The description there. And then you'll also see that it also has a link, which will go to the GitHub repo, because that's what I actually just had linked in my command line. So you can go ahead and send it to any documentation site, whatever. You can also go ahead and, if we wanted to, back in our module that we created over here around Key Vault, maybe we wanted to sort of set, you know, something like policy documentation or like general guidance documentation. We can actually use Markdown, so we can go ahead and say something along the lines of docs, and then we can go ahead and actually point that to, you know, our Confluence site or SharePoint or wherever it is that then sort of says, here are the allowed locations that we're allowed to publish to, right? So if we go to, let's just send it to Bing, right? We go back over to the file that we were deploying before over on is the Key Vault one. Should save that. We go ahead and jump back to here and then do our module for our Key Vault, and then choose our Key Vault. And what did I set that on? Set that on our location. So if we go ahead and location, again, you'll sort of see here is our link to, you know, click through, do we want to open Bing, right? So we can link that to documentation even, right? Which is also pretty cool. Cool. Secrets, go ahead.
How do I generate my documentation?
Generate my documentation. Good question. I probably won't get to it in terms of timing, but
better than what it was before?
No, it's pretty well the same. So yeah, I built a PowerShell module a little while ago that does some of that, but it hasn't received a lot of love. So it pretty well hasn't really significantly changed. But yes, you can do that. We probably won't get to it, but if you're interested, then see me after the session.
It's so awesome. It's like one of the best features.
Thank you.
Putting that on the Bernie's to-do list. It's like, except when I was using it, you had to convert to ARM.
Yeah, still the same.
Yeah.
So secrets. So say for example, we want to start using secrets as well. So there's a few different ways we can do this in Bicep. You can within a parameter file these days. You can go ahead, not that the storage account name is going to be secret, but say, for example, we did want to load a secret. The first thing that we would do would be back in our example, we would then go ahead and use something like make this secure. And so basically what that does within Bicep is it flags to Azure that when we deploy this parameter contains something sensitive in it. And so don't log that on the backplane and don't store that in the deployment history. Otherwise, anybody with read access could go to the deployment history and see potentially what that secret is. So you would definitely want to do that to start off with, to then flag that your parameter is sensitive. And then when we go ahead and then reference that, we can go ahead and use a get, it should be, oh no, sorry, it's only in a parameter file. So let's go back here. We can then go ahead and, yeah, so names needs to be assigned. So that should go ahead and names. Cool. So then we could do a few different things. Generally, you don't want to do this. but I'll show you it anyway because it's useful for other scenarios. So there's actually a option to go ahead and read something from an environment variable. So this is only available in Bicep param. Not a good thing for a secret, typically speaking, so don't use it, but it's helpful, very helpful for other scenarios, such as the environment that we want to deploy to and things like that. And so then it would be something like environment or whatever we set out the name of our environment variable to be. And this is sort of saying already, hey, there's no environment variable called environment. So it's giving me a red squiggly. So we can actually go ahead and set that to something by default, and it's all happy. What we do want to do with our secret parameter, though, is that we want to go ahead and basically use the get secret option instead. And again, this is where that whole native part comes in, because now we can actually just talk directly to a key vault in Azure, which is a secure way to store a secret in the first place. And we can go ahead and say, give our subscription ID, whatever that is for our subscription. We can then go ahead and give our resource group name. And then we can go ahead and give the name of the secret of the key vault. And then we would then go ahead and give the name of our secret, right? Whatever that is, right? I'm not going to bother populating it here, but we basically just throw those things together. And then what will happen is that when we go ahead and deploy this bicep param file, Azure at deployment time from the control plane will go out, talk to that key vault, pull the secret in, and then consume it. So our developer never needs to know the secret. Anybody that's in the source control, again, doesn't need to know the secret at all. The only thing that needs to be true is the deployment account that then is going to be triggering the pipeline needs some permission to be able to consume the secret. Otherwise, you just point it to any key vault and then you get the secret of something, right? So that's the main thing. Go ahead.
Banged my head up against the wall doing similar to that, particularly from Azure DevOps, where we've got policies that key vaults holding sensitive secrets cannot have public endpoints. How would you get around that?
Yeah. So the question is, so when you're deploying it from a CI/CD platform such as GitHub or Azure DevOps, then for the most part, as part of that, Microsoft provide a set of basically virtual machines that are managed by Microsoft or GitHub or whoever it is, that then will execute your automated pipelines, and those run in resources that we control or they control, right? As opposed to you build. And so the disadvantage of that, for the most part, is they're not connected to your internal network. So if you have policies that say we can only access key vaults from our internal network, which is probably a good policy to have, let's be honest, then those public services which are running these things won't necessarily be able to access them. So in almost all cases, they have a way to get around that, and that's basically go ahead and deploy a self-hosted agent, which is basically run a bit of software that connects out to the pipelines and sort of behaves exactly like it normally would, except you manage it on a virtual machine, and then it's connected to your internal network and then can access your key vault. GitHub actually has a new a feature that's currently experimental and preview, which then allows you to run a GitHub managed runner, which is the same sort of as a DevOps agent, and then connect that into a Azure VNet. So that's an experimental feature at the moment that you can use and try out. And so there's docs around that, but that's one option. I don't believe that's coming for DevOps at this point, but it is available in preview for GitHub. Yeah.
Essentially, I had a lot of problems on security in a project. I'm saying we can't get around the policy, and there's significant delay while they're figuring out how to spin up their own runners, and with all the tools that are pre-built into, say, GitHub Actions. Pre-roll, like. Yeah.
I'll show you one thing, because again, it's relevant, but I won't spend too much time on it. But there is a GitHub runner self-hosted images. There is a repo on GitHub, and I'm pretty sure this is the right one. I don't think it is actually. I think it's called virtual machines or something like that. I'll find it later, but basically there's a public GitHub repo that actually has all the tooling that then is run on the GitHub runners. And because it's actually the same platform, sort of under the covers, is Azure Pipelines. So there's actually a public repo with that. The reality is that the 100 tools that we install on those things, most organizations don't actually need these tools. So I would just sort of say, build a runner or a self-hosted agent that just has the tools you need, right? And for most cases, it's pretty minimalistic.
Thank you.
That's okay. Yeah, so you can get your secrets from your Key Vault like that. Again, we would just go ahead and put our subscription ID, our resource group, our Key Vault name, and then whatever the name of our secret was in there, and away we go. So that's a better option. So this is just a native Azure thing that we absolutely should do. We can also do this within Bicep files as well. And so we can actually go ahead and do it by referencing an existing resource. So if we wanted to go ahead and use a resource, call it our secret Key Vault, we'd then go ahead and use Key Vault vaults, choose an API version, use the existing keyword, which basically then flags, don't deploy this Key Vault, use this as a reference for something, for another operation that we wanted to perform. So then we go ahead and give it the name of our Key Vault, whatever that is, Key Vault 01. We also, if it's in a different resource group, we might need to also set the scope to sort of say, go ahead and find this maybe in a different subscription or in a different resource group, right? And so if it was in a different resource group, then we'd just go ahead and specify maybe it's in RG important keys, right? Whatever it is, right? Doesn't really matter. Often if you're deploying from like shared secrets and things like that, maybe like virtual machine administrator passwords, then that might come from a common location. Ideally, you want to keep it in its own location, again, for a security boundary. But if you wanted to do that, then that would be how you then choose a different resource group. And to do a different subscription, you just basically do, the subscription here. This will just be whatever the subscription ID is. So this would be GUID, right? Which have you good there, right? Cool. And then so to then reference that, you then go ahead and wherever it is you intend to reference it. Again, obviously we wouldn't actually put a secret in our storage account name, but if we were then going to then reference our secret Key Vault, we'd then be able to go ahead and get secret, and then we just give the name of our secret there, right? And this is probably complaining because, hey, you shouldn't go ahead and put a, well, it's basically saying that the expression can't be evaluated at this point. But again, you absolutely should not put a secret in the name of your resource. Cool. Let's double check. I think we have most of that. The bits that I want to briefly touch on is imports. So again, it happens pretty commonly. Storage. I don't remember what I called that. I haven't said it at all. So storage. So it happens pretty commonly that we want to reference information that then is reused across our environments. So a feature that was introduced reasonably recently is the idea of an import. So we've got our production bicep there. Again, there is maybe some common things that we actually want to go ahead and then reuse. So now we can go ahead and use the import keyword. And so this basically allows us to pull in information from another bicep file and then actually reuse it across other files, right? So it's sort of a little bit like a module, except this actually allows us to then use more like configuration information as opposed to other resources. So we can actually, I've got a file that I've already created. It's called Global Bicep down here. It's got some common things in here that might be helpful, right? So maybe I've got the prefix of my storage account, the prefix of my key vault, the prefix of my resource group. Just update that slightly. IG dash, right? Maybe I've got a log analytics workspace that I need to use across my organization. Again, maybe I can basically go ahead and set that there. Maybe I've got a common set of environments in terms of the type, right? And I've even got functions in there that I can use, which the functions part is actually an experimental feature. So we do need to turn that on in our Bicep config. So our experimental features are basically experimental feature flags. We can basically go ahead and turn those on, right? There's a bunch of them there. But if I wanted to go ahead and import, just do empty from, again, if I go ... the completion, this is again not 100% complete. The completion is not 100% here, so it won't automatically work for me. Well, bicep, but it will find that file. And then we should be able to control space here, maybe not. If we go ahead and just get prefix, import prefix, right? Found it there. Now we can then go ahead in our storage account name. We could do something like, maybe have a standard such as, ST, like dash dev, whatever, some additional random characters in here. Maybe this ST, this naming standard is a common thing. We can now go ahead and pull that in from our prefix and storage account. So now we actually only need to define that once and we can just pull that in. That's a fairly basic example, but there's lots of use cases that this becomes really helpful, right? Again, similar with the functions that I just mentioned here. So if we go back down here and have a look at this function, our resource group naming function. So if we go back to our resource group example that we had over here before, right? Maybe we want to name our resource group. This. Let me go ahead and just add. It won't work on that top name property, but go ahead and do it on our resource group name here. Then we can go ahead and instead, let me just go ahead and import that in. Import fix from ... /. 1, 2, 3. Is that enough? Maybe I need one more level. There you go. And then now we can go ahead and also import in resource group name. And then I can actually go ahead and run a resource group name function. And again, you can sort of see here it now gives us some guidance around, okay, the name of the resource group. So I'm going to have my app name of, demo. I'm going to have my environment, which again, you can see is pre-populating based on some things that I set in there. And then the instance is going to be 1, right? And then if we go back to this function, this is actually going to go ahead and build out my name of this is my resource group with an interpolation, automatically pad. I've put 1 in there, so then it will automatically pad that with 0, so it'll be 001, right? Some pretty cool things there. And so to make that happen, again, it's just another bicep file, except we now just have this @export syntax, which basically sort of says make this available for importing in other files.
It's fine import into the parameter file too.
You can't put in import into parameter files, I think, from memory. Let's give it a go. Maybe we can. So we want to import prefix. That's a nice easy one from label. Bicep. There you go. Looks like we can. Just pretty cool.
Yes, seen before. It's good to have like your naming conventions and everything.
yeah.
That's what's about the date, time and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just additional parameter that I defined. So yeah, so you can use that, which is again pretty helpful in terms of generic configuration. You can also go ahead and import resources, which we'll touch on in a sec. Similar for just YAML and JSON, you can again also import these. I don't think you can import them into parameter files. I'm pretty sure it needs to be a main module, but we can go ahead and say, for example, we had some variable of configuration. We can then go ahead and load from JSON and then basically just give it a JSON file. So if we go ahead and, I don't know, just pull in bicep config, let's just do that. That's a JSON file that I already have, bicep config. Now, if I wanted to then pull that in, I don't know, let's just go into service, config. And again, you can sort of see this is the actual things that are in that file, right? So pulling in JSON, super easy, works the same with YAML. There's also a few other ones as well, which are yet less useful, but you can just do text, and you can also load it as base64. So there's a few cases in Azure where you might need to load in like a public key or something like that, or another file uploaded. So again, base64 is helpful for those particular scenarios. Cool. Let's jump back, being mindful of time. Importing resources. So this is a cool one that you absolutely should know about. So let's show it. So the general idea is we want to go out to Azure and then grab stuff and then basically pull it into our code. Because again, it's probably something that you might want to do, right? If you've already got existing investment in Azure, you might want to then start converting things to infrastructure as code. We can go to our JSON view option here and then pull out our resource ID. So that's a good way to get it. You can also go ahead and often there'll be a properties option down the left-hand side. And in this case here, it doesn't have a resource ID, but often most resources will have the resource ID there too. And so if we jump back to VS Code now, and so you need to be authenticated. You'll need to be authenticated to Azure via the Bicep CLI, and or potentially any other options that then you have, such as Azure PowerShell. There's a few different ways you can do it. And then you can go ahead and then insert resource, and then you can plug in the resource ID. And then hopefully in a few seconds, it does take a little while, it should extract out the resource and then paste it in there. Hopefully, if the demo gobs it with me, that'll work. And it has. So you can sort of see there now it's basically just sucked in the Azure configuration of what I had. And now we've got Bicep code, which is pretty cool, right? So probably the only, I guess, it's not really a gotcha, but something to be aware of is just like when we were going and defining our, in our example over here, we defined a storage account and then we defined a blob services container underneath that. That's actually got a new unique resource ID. So if we wanted to pull that in, then we'd obviously need to make sure that our resource ID there included those additional slashes in there. And it's not very easy in most cases from the Azure portal to pull those things in. You can obviously easily see them, particularly if you're using the Azure CLI, to sort of see what they are by basically using the CLI commands. It'll dump that out as JSON and I'll have the resource IDs in there almost all the time. So that's a good way to find it. Otherwise, it's just basically like if we wanted to build that, it would be effectively my string, which would be my subscription GUID, my resource group name, and then let me just turn on word wrap. Then if we were doing this for my storage account, it would go ahead and just copy this in here. We'd then put in here would be the name of my storage account. Blob services, this has a default name, so you will see that in the doco if you find that out, but otherwise you will be struggling for days to work that one out. And then just the name of the container. So this would be maybe our container, or maybe our data container, right? Oops, data, right? And then we could actually go ahead and just throw that in to, again, our insert resource option here, and it would basically pull that in, right? Cool. We can also use existing ARM templates. So almost identically or exactly identically to what we did with our key vault here, with our plot here. So we referenced our Bicep module here. If this was actually a JSON file, so if I go ahead and build my ARM template here, and it should pop out a JSON file for me, except I've got errors in that file, so that's not going to work. Let's try our example instead. Build ARM template. So I've got a JSON file, and this is effectively my ARM template, which I don't really need to think about, but it's there if I want to. If I go back to my prod, instead of actually doing my Bicep, I actually can just put in JSON, and it'll actually work exactly the same. So all my existing ARM templates, if I've got any at all, I can start using Bicep today, get the benefits of Bicep for wherever I've got my Bicep code, but then not really have to change anything that I already have, right? So, yeah.
Another good one is PowerShell
PowerShell.
embedded in Bicep.
PowerShell, yeah, you can embed PowerShell in Bicep. Yeah, so that's a good for importing your text content. So maybe I had some additional files that I wanted to import in. Again, I don't really have it set up for that, but I could again, if this was actually, I don't know, maybe this was a text content or something like that, right? I could go ahead and just basically load from text content and actually go ahead and pass my PowerShell file in, and it would actually load that into that that property, which obviously won't work for this. But
to delete certain resources in a resource group.
Yeah, so you can use a deployment script. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great
workaround. Are you going to use it in normal situations? Right?
What's that?
I thought it's a special case, right?
It's always a hack.
Yeah, sure.
cool.
So how did your security take to that?
It's all good. Don't worry about it.
As long as they don't know about it.
Yeah, so that's all good. So the other thing to note is that we can also go ahead and export information out. So we often there's often cases where we want to go ahead and then pull information from another module to then use it again. So an example would be maybe for my for my resource group, but maybe for my storage account, maybe then I need to go ahead and then add permissions to that storage account, something like that, like as in grant something else access to it. And so I can actually use output to then go ahead and pull information out. And so then when I reference it back over here or wherever, so I've got some from the other module that I had up before. Let's jump across to, maybe not. Let's just quickly add it to this here. So let's just go ahead and add storage account name string, and then this just becomes my storage dot name. And then when I jump back to here, then if I want to then basically then consume that somewhere else, right? So what parameters I've got here, name, I'll just use that as an example. We can then reference my storage, which was basically the name that I used up here, and then dot outputs, and then whatever else is there should populate. maybe that is not populating because there's a module error there. That could very well be the reason. But yeah, it should just go ahead and populate out there. So again, that's a common scenario that then is pretty helpful in a lot of cases. So yeah, so there's a number of things there. So let's just finish off on a few things that again are pretty helpful. So let's just jump back to the slides because there's a few things here that then is worthwhile knowing about. So you can use Azure CLI and PowerShell. So both are supported to use Bicep and deploy Bicep. GitHub Actions and Azure Pipelines automatically have the CLI tools installed to then do this. So you don't need to install really any additional tools there. Apart from if you want to control the version of Bicep, because again, releases come out every month. You may want to like adopt the latest feature before it's released on the self-hosted agents, or you may want to roll back to a previous version if maybe the feature that you want to use has now been broken as a result, right? So you may want to install a specific version. For doing things like testing, there's also tools that you can use for testing. So PS Rule for Azure and Bench Press. So these are both basically PowerShell-based tools that we can run in our CI/CD pipelines to automatically test our code. Defender for cloud as well. So I'll show that briefly in a sec, but basically we can also do DevSecOps scanning of our code as well with Microsoft Defender for Cloud. And let's just jump across to that and have a quick look, which I should have up here if it hasn't disappeared. Cool. So this basically is an ability within Azure to then go ahead and hook up. So it comes under Microsoft Defender for Cloud and DevOps Security. So again, you'll just find it down here and then over on DevOps Security here. And so by default, there won't be anything obviously populated here for you until you go ahead and add an environment. And so basically GitHub and Azure DevOps are supported, and GitLab, I think, is still in preview, are supported. You need to deploy a connector. The connector itself doesn't cost anything, but it will deploy it to a specific region where the data is stored. And that will basically reach out to your DevOps environment and pull in the information. As part of setting that up, you will be asked for authorization, of course, and you'll just need to provide basically OAuth authorization for the most part to then connect up your DevOps repo. And so setting up the connector is a very, it's a few-step wizard. It's pretty straightforward. You'll basically put your details in, click next. Let me just quickly choose something, and then effectively you'll authorize, and then a few seconds later it's done. In terms of scanning, it will then go ahead and periodically scan your environment, those environments, and pull it in. So the information won't come in straight away, but it will come in about an hour or so. You'll start seeing your repos. In very large organizations, it may take a little bit longer in terms of your DevOps organization. But effectively, then you'll have all your repos listed here. And then you can actually go ahead and, so they'll start off with as off, and basically just means that there's no protection in place there at that point, but it's aware of the repo. And then you can go ahead and click on them and basically go ahead and complete the setup. So basically, there's sort of two parts. One, there is, and I don't have any permissions, so I'm not sure how far I'll get, but yeah, that's probably I can't. But basically, I can enable pull request annotations, which basically says whenever I go ahead and start committing code as a developer, if there's an error, then it will actually go ahead and flag that for me, but also it will appear as a detection in here, right? So it appears in both places. So you've got central governance, plus then the developer knows that they need to do something, right? And also, you also do need to add just a step in your pipeline, which will basically then go ahead and collect the information and basically do the enforcement. So basically, it's a two-step process. But basically, once you've done the discovery, you know all your repos, and then you can basically start just turning that on a per repo basis. And so then when you start to get detections, it'll just appear as just general recommendations. And the normal Azure Microsoft Defender for Cloud stuff will just basically start populating in here as recommendations. So we'll have a quick look, and there should be, might be, I'm slightly zoomed in, but if I go to Azure DevOps and turn off Azure, then we can just go ahead and sort of see any recommendations, and hopefully we will have some, maybe under all recommendations.
Okay, it's perfect.
This is a it's a demo environment, so it should have some stuff, but you can sort of see there, you know, contain images, and it will do infrastructure as code as well, right? So there's a few things there that then it's basically detecting.
So is smarts building for Google Cloud and AWS with regards to bad coding around resources provisioned or something like that? Or?
Potentially, yes. I'm not 100% sure on the details there, but it pulls in a few different tools. One of them is Terrascan, which then does have open source and also for other cloud recommendations as well. So yes, there will be some in there, but can't necessarily say from my own experience.
So is there a endpoint scanning capability to actually hit a live endpoint and do a automated security pen test?
Yeah, so I guess, is there an automated scan for an endpoint? It is not specifically part of the DevOps part or the DevOps security, but it is part of Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Yeah. So within Microsoft Defender for Cloud, there is different under environment settings. There's different plans that then you can choose to enable or not. And so when you go into your subscription down here, you can go ahead and set Defender plans. And so in these Defender plans, there's different features that you can turn on. When you go ahead and turn on the servers one, particularly on the plan 2, then one of the things that's included in that cost is a vulnerability assessment scanning engine. And so basically, if you go ahead and do settings, there is vulnerability assessment for virtual machines. So it'll basically, I think it installs an agent for this particular case as well. For this default case, there's also an agentless option as well. So for your normal Azure virtual machines, you sort of have two options. You have basically an offline scan, which we'll have a look in a sec, which is configured in a slightly different location, or you can just do an agent-based one. And so for your on-premises ones, again, because this actually is hybrid as well, so this will actually work for AWS and on-premises as well. In those particular cases, for the most part, it requires an agent to be deployed, and it will do a scan against the virtual machine using that agent. For the agentless options, which is also available in AWS as well, you can then, alternatively, you can go ahead and do the CSPM. And in the CSPM, there is an agentless discovery, agentless scanning for VMs or for machines. And basically the way that works is it basically takes a snapshot of the disks of the virtual machine and then mounts those and scans those offline. So that's also an option that you can use. But for that, you then also need to have the Defender CSPM on as well. So you basically need both of those options to get that.
What about websites and destructive web pen testing?
Not in terms of pen testing, no. There is load-based testing, but that's a separate resource.
Yeah.
Happy to talk with you offline about that.
Cool.
Yeah, so for Defender, for infrastructure as code, then basically DevOps security, that'll also handle other code-based security as well. If you have GitHub advanced security enabled for either GitHub or Azure DevOps as well. But it'll basically suck all those findings into a central location. Cool. So was there any questions that then you, or any questions that you had that then I haven't covered that then you desperately want to answer? Because there's so much I can continue probably going for another hour at least. But since we are getting close to 8, I can't do that. So if there's any questions, any burning questions, let me know now, or come up and see me after. Yeah.
Briefly, what's happened in PS Rule in the last few months?
Sure. So PS Rule. So yeah, so PS Rule is a personal project that I run, which is open source. And so probably the easiest way to find out about that is PS-Rule.
PS Rule?
It does, yes. The Defender for DevOps, yeah. And there should be change log, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And so then this is basically what's happened. And so we generally do a release a month. So if you wanted to go 3 months back, then that would probably be about here. So there's a reasonable amount of stuff that's happened. Probably the highlights. I'm getting a lot of interest around pillar-based baselines. So that's pretty new. So it allows you to do a specific pillar. Also, the bicep parameter file, again, is now generally, that was a feature that was available for a while, but more in experimental mode. So that's generally available. There's also a bunch of rules over the last few months. We've shipped a bunch of rules for AI and machine learning services as well. And we're also making progress to automatically create rules based on Azure policies as well. So that's probably going pretty good. Yeah, happy to speak to you after the break.
I haven't looked for a while because I work in an entirely telephone shop now. But for anyone that hasn't used it and is in the bicep world, it's fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So the final notes, so we can wrap up, is there is actually a monthly bicep community call. This is available for anybody to join. It's just a Teams call. They alternate every month on a Australia-friendly time versus a US-friendly time. So sign up for it. And there's also YouTube recordings of the previous ones. And we are running out of time, so I'm going to be very quick. I did want to just one more touch on.
Finish up.
Okay, sure, fair enough. I mean, keep
going. No, that's fine.
Okay. The only other one thing that I wanted to cover, which, again, so much things to cover, is Azure verified modules, which I had a link in here. So let's just go back. So I did mention before, but we didn't actually get around to it. But just like you're building modules in your environment, there's also a Microsoft set of patterns that then are actually being built, basically ready to go. And so Azure verified modules is that. And this really allows you to basically kickstart those patterns. So if you don't want to necessarily build your own bicep modules, you should absolutely check out Azure verified modules, because that's a great starting point to then start consuming some of these patterns. So that's all I had. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Bernie. Thank you very much for your presentation. So for any of you who are keen to present, there's bribery involved.
What's in the bag?
It's a secret.
Is it worth it, Bernie?
It's worth doing a presentation.
He's from the police. It should be a brown bag.
They ran out of brown bags. They're all taken.
Are you going to do another one?
So, thank you, Bernie.
Yeah, thank Bernie. Happy.
No worries.
Well,
Let's buy something.
let's wait for
Nice to
price
see you.
to come out. So Lydia's next.
Nice to see you. Next one.
Try and get to Japan.
Yeah, thank you. And have a good night. if you've got any other questions, then come and see me.
Thank you.
It's very cool.
Yeah.
Right, it's all there, right?
Thanks, mate.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.